The trickster isn't just some mischievous side character from ancient myths. It's a living, breathing psychic function buried deep in the unconscious. Carl Jung saw this archetype as a disruptive yet necessary force that destabilizes rigid ego structures. But over time, especially in pop psychology, this nuanced figure has been flattened into a cartoonish symbol of chaos or cleverness. That's not only inaccurate, it's dangerously misleading. The trickster is more than a prankster. It's a mirror, a test, and sometimes a wake-up call the ego didn't see coming. Jung's original view ties the trickster directly to the individuation process. When your ego becomes too rigid, too sure of itself, the trickster creeps in through the cracks. It challenges identity, mocks repression, and confronts inflation by turning the spotlight on the shadow. So if you're stuck in a loop of self-sabotage or unexpected setbacks, don't rush to call it bad luck. It might just be the psyche's way of demanding evolution. Not everything that breaks you is here to destroy you. Some things are meant to unmask you. Sadly, many today mistake this inner provocateur for a spiritual guide or aesthetic motif. They dress the trickster up in new age robes, post ironic memes, or glamorize it as a lifestyle. But this isn't about aesthetic rebellion. It's about psychological necessity. The trickster doesn't exist to entertain. It exists to destabilize whatever has calcified in your inner world. That includes your inflated persona, your over-intellectualized ego, or your disowned shadow. In this light, Jungian psychology isn't some esoteric map for dreamers. It's a field manual for navigating real internal warfare. The trickster archetype is like a psychic regulator, a feedback mechanism that reboots the system when the ego strays too far from the unconscious. When people speak of synchronicities, inexplicable disruptions, or strange patterns, what if that's not randomness, but a mythological trickster knocking? This is where the ego's story meets its editor, and it rarely likes the rewrites. Understanding the trickster through this lens sets the stage for a much deeper confrontation, not just with the shadow, but with the very mechanics of the ego. Because if the ego isn't the king of the psyche, then who or what is? That question opens up a much deeper exploration into shadow and ego dynamics, and that's exactly where we're headed next. Shadow and ego dynamics. Most people think of the shadow as simply the dark side of their personality, but that's just scratching the surface. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is a dense constellation of everything the ego refuses to accept. Impulses, memories, desires, even virtues we've buried to keep our persona intact. Now, throw the trickster into this volatile mix, and suddenly we're not talking about just inner conflict. We're talking about a full-blown psychological mutiny. The ego thinks it's in charge, but the unconscious? It has other plans. Here's the real twist. Jung often framed the ego and shadow as binary, like opposing forces in constant tension. But what if that model is incomplete? A more dynamic way to see it is through psychosystems analysis, where the psyche is viewed as a self-regulating system aiming for homeostasis. In this model, the trickster isn't just a clown in the psyche's court. It's a regulatory function. When the ego becomes inflated or represses too much unconscious content, the trickster steps in to restore balance. Let's make this real. Imagine someone overly identified with their intellect, maybe a spiritual influencer who's built an entire identity around knowing the truth. But deep down, they've repressed emotional wounds, moral complexes, or even their basic need for connection. As their ego inflates, the trickster stirs the shadow. Suddenly, their relationships fall apart, followers turn on them, or they face public embarrassment. That's not punishment. That's a psychodynamic correction. Inflation is seductive. It feels like confidence, like control. But when the ego expands without regulation, it loses contact with the unconscious. And that's when the trickster gets loud. You'll notice it in moments of projection, when your reactions to others say more about you than them. You'll see it in irrational decisions, or when reality seems to glitch. That's not coincidence. That's compensation. And the trickster is the one writing the script. What's wild is how often people misread these disruptions. They don't realize they're wrestling with a part of their own psyche designed to restore internal order. The trickster doesn't want chaos for its own sake. It wants integration. But to understand why it behaves this way, we need to zoom out even further into the very biology of psyche itself and how genomic intent plays a role in these psychological corrections. Psychosystems analysis and genomic intent. Let's step outside the myth for a moment and get clinical. Psychosystems analysis, as developed by Steve and Pauline Richards, introduces a game-changing perspective. Instead of treating the psyche as a battlefield between good and evil, they frame it as an adaptive, evolving system governed by an underlying genomic homeostatic intent. Translation: your psyche is biologically wired to stay balanced, and the trickster shows up when that balance starts to unravel. It's not just mythological mischief. It's self-regulation written in your psychological DNA. Imagine your psyche like a thermostat. When temperatures rise too high, through ego inflation, denial, or repression, the trickster kicks in to cool things down. But if ignored, it cranks up the feedback. First it whispers, a slip of the tongue, a weird dream. Then it jokes, mocks, distorts. And if still unheard, it can manifest externally. That's when we start seeing field phenomena like synchronicities, symbolic accidents, or even classic poltergeist disruptions, an outer echo of inner disorder. This is more than theory. In case after case, the Richards framework shows that the trickster escalates through predictable stages. It may begin as a psychopomp, a guide between the conscious and unconscious. But if the individual resists integration, it can become a chaos agent. That's not a metaphor. In psychosomatic medicine, this often aligns with real disruptions in adaptive function, immune disorders, relational breakdowns, even identity crises. The psyche doesn't just think, it reacts. Now here's the kicker. All of this points to a genomic intent that's not just reactive, but evolutionary. The psyche isn't merely correcting error. It's pushing toward growth, complexity, and individuation. The trickster, then, becomes both warning and invitation, an energetic nudge to shed the false self and integrate disowned content. When we ignore that call, we don't just stall, we regress. That's when we see loops of neurosis, projection, and personality fragmentation. So next time life feels like it's flipping tables on you, ask yourself, what has your ego ignored? What psychic message has been knocking on the back door? Because if we continue to miss the internal cues, the trickster doesn't disappear. It simply changes tactics. And its next move? Well, that's where we start to see the trickster step fully into its role as a homeostatic regulator. Trickster as homeostatic regulator. If the psyche were a city, the trickster would be its wildcard regulator, like a rebellious civil engineer who destroys a bridge just to force you to take a better route. It's not doing it for fun. It's correcting dysfunction. When your internal world veers too far from equilibrium, the trickster emerges, not as a villain, but as a field phenomenon aiming to restore psychological homeostasis. This is what most people miss. The trickster isn't against you. It's against your delusion. It usually starts small. Maybe you get called out in a meeting, say the wrong thing on a first date, or dream of your childhood home catching fire. These are early-stage trickster signals. If acknowledged, they guide the ego back toward balance. But if dismissed, the intensity increases. Sarcasm turns to sabotage. Coincidences get weird. Relationships implode or careers collapse. Not because life is cruel, but because your psyche is smarter than your plans. This isn't superstition. It's the mechanics of adaptive compensation. When repression builds up, when your external regulation no longer aligns with your internal truth, the trickster intervenes. That's when you stop being able to fake it. The persona cracks. The smile you were becomes unbearable. And suddenly, you're either spiraling or waking up. The choice isn't between chaos or control. It's between illusion and integration. Let's be real. Most people don't want to hear this. They'd rather spiritualize the trickster, glamorize it, or blame external forces. But the deeper truth is simpler and scarier. You are being haunted by what you refuse to feel. That's why the trickster doesn't go away when you ignore it. It evolves. And when it shows up in full force, through breakdowns, synchronicities, or even eerie disturbances, it's not trying to scare you. It's trying to reboot you. Because here's the thing. This archetype isn't interested in your comfort. It's interested in your growth. And when the ego becomes inflated, blind to its own limits, the trickster takes the stage with one clear objective: deflation. But what happens when inflation takes over completely and projection distorts your entire reality? That's when the trickster moves from regulator to executioner. Projection, inflation, and psychological collapse. Nothing invites the trickster faster than ego inflation. When someone begins to mistake their persona for their true self, especially when fueled by intellect, charm, or spiritual superiority, the psychic system prepares a wake-up call. That's when the trickster emerges not as a teacher, but as a destroyer. It manipulates projections, distorts perception, and activates synchronicities so precise they can feel supernatural. But they're not miracles. They're messages. And those who believe they've mastered the trickster often fall hardest under its weight. Let's say someone builds an identity as a guru, a thought leader, or even just the funny one in the group. Slowly, they start believing their own performance. Their inflationary ego detaches from a shadow, and repression compounds. At first, everything works, until one day, the trickster flips the script. A public embarrassment, a betrayal, a psychic collapse. This isn't sabotage. It's forced integration. And those who survive it, they're usually transformed forever. The trickster thrives in projection. It uses what you see in others as a mirror for what you avoid in yourself. That annoying coworker might reflect your disowned ambition. That toxic ex, your repressed longing. Projection isn't weakness. It's a signal. But when the ego refuses to examine those signals, the psyche escalates. That's when reality starts to bend. Uncanny coincidences, unexplainable events, even brief identity dissociation. That's not crazy. That's the system resetting. This collapse phase can mimic madness, but it's really a breakdown of outdated scripts. The ego built on illusion cannot survive real introspection. So the trickster, using its full arsenal, humor, chaos, even dread, tears it apart. This is where most people either retreat into victimhood or awaken into deeper self-awareness. Those who cling to their inflated mask, they become caricatures of their former selves. Those who listen, they begin the individuation process for real. But this isn't just about personal breakdowns. Projection and inflation happen collectively too, in cultures, groups, and ideologies. So what happens when the trickster moves beyond the individual psyche and begins haunting entire systems? That's when we need to explore the collective dimension of this archetype and how it shapes our myths, our leaders, and our collapse. Personal versus collective trickster dynamics. People often wonder, is the trickster inside me or out in the world? The answer is yes. The trickster operates both personally and collectively. On a personal level, it hijacks your ego through projection, complex activation, and self-sabotage. On a collective level, it infiltrates cultural myths, political narratives, and social movements. Whether it shows up in your life or on the world stage, its function is the same: to restore balance by dismantling illusion and exposing disowned truths. Think of it as the psyche's whistleblower. Let's talk personal first. You've seen this play out in your own life. When you keep attracting the same kind of partner, fall into patterns you swore you outgrew, or find yourself sabotaging the very thing you prayed for. That's the personal trickster. It loops you until you see. But now zoom out. What about when a society idolizes an inflated persona, be it a celebrity, a politician, or a guru, and then that figure falls from grace in a spectacular collapse? That's the collective trickster in action. These cultural implosions aren't accidents. They're field phenomena, emergent patterns from a collective unconscious trying to purge its shadow. Jung called this the mythopoetic function of the psyche. Archetypes like the trickster erupt when lies go viral and truths get buried. When societies glamorize spiritual bypassing, celebrate the shallow, or repress the real, the trickster shows up with jokes, scandals, uprisings, and ironic reversals. And always it targets inflation. So how do we know whether we're dealing with personal sabotage or a collective pattern? Usually both are involved. A trickster event in your life may mirror a larger cultural pattern, and vice versa. That's why myth matters. Personal myths and cultural myths aren't separate. They overlap, echo, and amplify one another. And when your personal myth aligns with collective dysfunction, the trickster's feedback gets louder, faster, and harder to ignore. Which brings us to one of the trickiest trickster masks of all, the jester. The one who jokes while truth-bombing kings. The one who hides wisdom in chaos. Because sometimes the ego doesn't hear logic. It only listens when it's being mocked. And this leads us right into the next layer of this archetype's symbolism. The dance between kings, jesters, and gods. Symbolism and myth. Kings, jesters, and gods. Picture the psyche as a kingdom. The ego plays the king, commanding, organizing, regulating. It believes it rules the land. But lurking in the court is the jester, sarcastic, irreverent, unpredictable. That's the trickster. And while the king appears to have power, it's often the jester who holds the deeper truth. This symbolic dynamic is crucial. The king represents the executive function of the psyche, but without the trickster's feedback, the king drifts into tyranny, also known as ego inflation. That's when the jesters start whispering jokes that sound a lot like prophecy. In myth, the trickster is rarely just comic relief. Whether it's Hermes, Mercury, Loki, or even Coyote, these figures exist to challenge authority and dissolve rigidity. They insult gods, seduce queens, and steal fire, not because they're evil, but because they serve a greater balancing force. They humble the king. In Jungian terms, this means destabilizing the ego when it becomes disconnected from the unconscious. The jester's role is to pop the ego's bubble before the kingdom burns down. Now, here's where people often get confused. Some mistake the king as an archetype of the self, of wholeness. But in this symbolic system, the king is not the self. The king is the ego's delusion of wholeness. The true self is beyond any one function. It includes the jester, the king, and the entire psychic kingdom. That's why dethroning the king isn't failure, it's integration. The trickster doesn't want to destroy the kingdom. It wants to remind the king he's not God. Look at your own life. Have you ever been king of something? Your relationship, your job, your spiritual identity, only to have it collapse through embarrassment or chaos. That's the jester at work. It comes for whatever power you've over-identified with, and it uses irony as a scalpel. You'll laugh, but you'll bleed. And through that symbolic bloodletting, you might actually wake up. But what happens when people stop integrating these symbols and start idolizing them instead? When they get high off the drama of myth without ever doing the psychological work. That's when archetypal fascination becomes dangerous. And the trickster? It sharpens its claws. The misuse and dangers of archetypal fascination. We live in a time where mythology is aestheticized and archetypes are consumed like candy. People proudly call themselves tricksters, witches, kings, or oracles, yet rarely stop to ask what those roles mean psychologically. This isn't just cosplay of the soul, it's spiritual inflation in disguise. When someone clings to archetypal labels without doing shadow work, they're not individuating, they're escaping. And the trickster? It watches, it waits, and eventually it strikes to dismantle the illusion. There's a fine line between myth as medicine and myth as narcotic. Archetypes are meant to reveal unconscious material, not replace it with a new identity. But when someone, for example, calls themselves a chaos magician while avoiding intimacy, or a warrior spirit while refusing to feel grief, that's not depth, it's defense. And what's more dangerous than a defended ego wearing the mask of depth? Almost nothing. The persona becomes weaponized. The psyche splits, and integration halts. The trickster reacts strongly to this kind of fakery. When myth is used to inflate rather than humble the ego, the feedback gets sharp. Relationships dissolve. Goals backfire. Synchronicities feel mocking rather than meaningful. This isn't punishment, it's adaptive compensation. The psyche always seeks wholeness. And when the person won't strip away the mask, the psyche sends something to rip it off. Gently at first, brutally if needed. This is why spiritual communities are often riddled with scandal. Leaders claim divine insight while secretly repressing their shadows. Followers project archetypal meaning onto them until the trickster collapses the fantasy. What's left? Sometimes nothing but rubble. But that rubble is sacred, because beneath the false myth is the chance to build a personal myth, one that's earned, not performed. So before you declare yourself a mythic archetype, ask, have you integrated what it means? Are you living the myth or hiding behind it? Because the trickster knows the difference. And when charm or humor becomes a shield against your own vulnerability, it won't hesitate to turn that shield into a sword. Which brings us, ironically, to the next mask it wears, humor. Complexes, humor, and the mask of relatability. Humor is the trickster's favorite mask. It disarms, distracts, and dazzles. But beneath the laugh often hides a wound, and the trickster knows how to weaponize it. In Jungian psychology, laughter isn't always just lighthearted relief. Sometimes it's camouflage for repression. Think of the person who always jokes when things get emotional, or the one who makes fun of themselves to avoid deeper conversations. That's not just a personality trait, it's a defense mechanism. And when left unchecked, it can morph into self-sabotage. This is where the trickster plays its most seductive game. It convinces the ego that humor is strength, that charm is mastery. But over time, that adaptive compensation becomes rigid. The joke that once connected now distances. The charm that once attracted now repels. And worst of all, the person doesn't notice. They believe they're being relatable, when in truth, they're performing. The mask becomes the face, and the face forgets there was ever anything underneath. Humor, in this sense, becomes a complex, psychological knot tied between shame, repression, and the need to be accepted. When someone's entire persona is built on being the funny one, the ego can inflate around that identity. And what does the trickster do with inflation? It punctures it. Suddenly, the jokes stop landing. The audience turns cold. The inner critic gets louder. The very tool that protected you becomes the trap that isolates you. But it's not all doom and gloom. When integrated consciously, humor can become a bridge, a tool for connection and healing. The trick is knowing why you're using it. Are you laughing to deflect or to relate? To mock or to reveal? The trickster isn't against humor. It's against avoidance. When the laughter opens space for truth, the trickster bows. When it buries truth, the trickster attacks. So if you've ever wondered why your charm seems to sabotage your relationships, or why your best jokes feel hollow, look deeper. The trickster might be trying to show you something. And once you see it, you're faced with a choice. Keep performing or integrate. Because in the end, all masks must fall. And when they do, the question becomes, what part of you is ready to show up in the real world? Practical implications and real-world integration. After all the myth, mischief, and metaphor, we land where it matters most, real life. If the trickster is a psychic regulator, not a random disruptor, then ignoring its signals isn't just naive, it's self-destructive. This archetype doesn't exist to decorate your dreams or fuel esoteric theories. It exists to wake you up, and that means learning to live with self-awareness, not just self-image. Jungian psychology only becomes transformational when it's applied, not worshipped. So how do you apply it? Start with pattern recognition. Notice the jokes that sting, the slip-ups that repeat, the relationships that trigger. Ask yourself, what part of me keeps looping here? Is it a repression, a projection, an inflated persona? The trickster points you to these fault lines, not to shame you, but to push you toward integration. Think of it like psychic physical therapy. The more you resist, the more it hurts. The more you participate, the more you evolve. Then comes action. Drop the archetypal performance and ground yourself in practice. Journal your dreams. Watch for synchronicities, but don't obsess over them. Own your shadow and conflict. If you're tempted to play the charming clown, pause. What are you avoiding? If you feel a pattern repeating, track it like a hunter. Archetypes are maps, not identities. Use them to navigate, not to hide. And if you're not sure where to begin, books like Man and His Symbols or Owning Your Own Shadow are solid first steps. Also, don't try to outsmart the trickster. That's a losing game. It is your mind. It knows every loophole you try to exploit. Instead, befriend it. Integrate it. Let it challenge your executive function when needed, but also learn when it's just stirring chaos for chaos' sake. The trickster isn't here to be your enemy. It's here to test whether you're ready to be honest with yourself. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway of all. Jungian psychology isn't abstract. It's alive. The psyche is an evolutionary system. The archetypes are just its grammar. And the trickster? It's punctuation, the exclamation point that forces the sentence to end, or the question mark that asks, are you sure this is who you really are? Because once you answer that, the real transformation begins. Integration or repetition, the trickster's challenge. So now that you know who the trickster really is, what are you going to do the next time it shows up? Will you dismiss it as coincidence, call it bad luck, or blame someone else for the disruption in your life? Or will you pause, take a breath, and ask, was my psyche trying to show me? Because here's the truth most people avoid. The chaos you're running from might be the exact doorway to the version of you you've never met. You can keep inflating your persona. Keep hiding behind the charm, the intellect, the spiritual performance. Or you can face the one force inside you that's been pulling the strings behind your breakdowns. The trickster doesn't want to ruin your life. It wants to reset it. And if you're ready, really ready, to stop looping through the same patterns and start building a life from integration instead of illusion, then the path starts now. So what's your pattern? What lie have you repeated so often that even you started believing it? Drop in the comments. Say it out loud. Break the loop. And while you're here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this isn't just a video. It's a journey into the truth of who you really are, shadow and all. And trust me, the trickster is already watching.